She doesn't look like she can afford first class. Probably used food stamps or someone else's credit card. That's what the flight attendant said out loud, in front of a full line of passengers. Loud enough for heads to turn. And no one said a word. A black woman, alone, holding a legitimate first-class ticket, mocked, redirected to a seat near the lavatory, asked to show her bank account, and told she was a fraud risk because of her income bracket and skin color. Before the flight even left the ground, she was humiliated, isolated, and judged. But what no one knew was that she had the power to freeze every asset tied to the airline by the time they landed. This is not just a story about prejudice. It's a takedown in slow motion of arrogance, of systemic bias, and of every person who thought she wouldn't fight back. If you're here for justice that hits hard and flips the script, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what part hit you the hardest? The terminal at JFK buzzed with the measured chaos of a weekday morning. Business travelers in pressed suits clutching coffee, announcements echoing over the intercom, the occasional scuff of a rolling suitcase over polished tile. Paige Campbell walked with calm precision, her posture upright, her focus unshaken, her carry-on sliding smoothly beside her. The ticket in her hand was digital, first class, confirmed and paid in full through an encrypted federal system. The suit she wore was clean and conservative, gray blazer, navy slacks, black flats. She was neither flashy nor out of place, yet as she neared the first-class counter, she felt what she'd felt 100 times before. The gaze, the pause, the instant calculus in someone else's eyes. She stepped into line behind a man in a crisp blue blazer who barely noticed her presence. The line moved slowly, and when it was finally her turn, she approached the counter with a polite smile. "Good morning, Paige Campbell. Confirmation number ending in 4729, she said as she presented her ID. The woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Trish, scanned the document and paused. Her brow furrowed in that calculated way, a subtle furrow that wasn't confusion. It was disbelief, maybe judgment. "First class?" Trish asked, louder than necessary, the question echoing through the waiting area. "Yes," Paige replied calmly. Trish scanned again, then again. She stared at the screen, then at Paige, then back at the screen. "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I mean, do you want to double-check your booking? These tickets start at over $3,000, depending on the day." Her voice wasn't hostile, but it carried a smug sharpness, the kind that dared people to prove they weren't lying. Paige didn't flinch. "I'm quite sure. That's the correct ticket. Purchased last Tuesday." Trish chuckled, more to herself than to Paige, and turned to her colleague, who had just walked up. "Hey Linda," she called over her shoulder. "You ever see someone try to use reward points for first class and forget they didn't qualify?" A woman standing nearby, blonde and tanned, turned at the sound of the comment and eyed Paige from head to toe. "Let me guess," she said loudly, lips curled into a smirk. "She used airline miles. Or maybe one of those charity raffles." Several passengers chuckled. Paige kept her gaze steady, jaw firm, eyes unflinching. She wasn't new to this. It never got easier, but she had grown skilled at not showing them anything. "I'll need a moment," Trish said, tapping away at her screen. "There's a flag on the ticket. Nothing major. Probably just a glitch." Paige's voice remained measured. "There shouldn't be. I used a secured federal procurement card." Trish stopped typing. "Federal? As in government?" "Yes," Paige said. "I'm on official travel." Trish's smile tightened. "Interesting." She tapped one more time, then pressed a small button beneath the counter. A chime sounded, and a uniformed airport security officer appeared moments later. "Problem?" he asked, glancing between Trish and Paige. "Possibly," Trish said sweetly. "Just a verification. Standard stuff." The officer nodded, stepping up beside Paige. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to verify your identity again. Do you have any documentation besides your license?" Paige handed over a federal ID card. He examined it, frowned. "Do you have anything with your financial information? Like a bank statement? A card used for the booking?" Paige narrowed her eyes. "Are you asking for my private banking information?" "It's just protocol," the officer said quickly. "We've had cases of stolen identities. And your name didn't show up in our elite passenger system. That's usually a red flag." "So now I'm a red flag?" Paige asked. Her voice was still calm, but it had developed an edge. The man shifted, clearly sensing a misstep, but unwilling to back off. "It's nothing personal, ma'am. Just standard procedure." "Standard for who?" she asked. "You didn't ask the gentleman in front of me for his financial history." Trish turned back to her terminal, muttering something under her breath. The officer glanced down at the ID again. "With respect, you don't fit the usual profile." "What profile is that?" Paige asked. Her voice dropped just slightly, the words cold and deliberate. "White. Male. Wearing a Rolex." The officer stepped back slightly. "I didn't mean you did," she cut in. "You just didn't expect me to notice." Around her, the lobby had grown quieter. A few passengers pretended not to eavesdrop. Others watched openly. The blonde woman rolled her eyes, whispering to a man beside her. Paige looked at the officer, then back to Trish. "If you need to verify something, I suggest you call the airline's liaison to the Department of the Treasury. My credentials are active. My clearance is level 7. And the last person who asked for my banking records is currently under federal audit." Trish blinked. The officer's brows lifted, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Trish clicked her tongue and forced a smile. "No need for all that. I'll just print your boarding pass. Looks like everything's cleared." She pressed the button without making eye contact. The printer spat out a pass. Paige took it without a word, slipped her ID back into her wallet, and turned to leave. The blonde woman watched her go, face blank. Paige didn't look back. She didn't need to. The story was already writing itself. Paige moved through the jet bridge with the same composed steps she'd taken since entering the terminal. But something inside her shifted the moment she stepped onto the aircraft. She was prepared for condescension. She had weathered it before, but not for how immediate and coordinated the shift would feel. As she offered her boarding pass to the smiling flight attendant at the aircraft door, the woman's eyes flicked down, scanned the seat number, then back up to Paige's face with the kind of polite doubt that wasn't overt, but intentional. "Ah, welcome," she said with a smile so practiced it felt laminated. "You're in 2A. Let me just double-check something." She turned quickly, tapped into her tablet, and frowned. "Looks like there's been a last-minute change due to an equipment issue in the front cabin. You've been reassigned to seat 9F. Paige blinked. "Excuse me." "It's just a temporary reallocation," the attendant said quickly. "You'll still receive first-class service. And we've placed you in a convenient location, near the lavatory, which is often requested by—" She didn't finish the sentence. Paige's voice remained steady. "Requested by who?" The woman hesitated. "By passengers with certain needs. It's better for those who might need assistance, or who, are not frequent flyers." "I didn't request a seat change," Paige said. "I paid for seat 2A specifically. Quiet. Window. Priority zone." The attendant kept smiling, but her eyes said she had expected resistance. "We understand, but we've had to make some changes. We appreciate your cooperation." Paige stared at her for a beat longer before responding. "What exactly are you implying about my needs?" The woman looked uncomfortable now, her smile cracking slightly. "Nothing at all. We're simply accommodating all passengers as best we can. The system. Does the system also accommodate all the other first-class passengers by moving them to the back of the plane?" Paige asked. The attendant said nothing, but her eyes flicked momentarily to a nearby passenger, a tall white man in a tailored charcoal suit, already settling comfortably into seat 2A. Paige saw him glance up, saw him suppress the smirk at the corner of his mouth, saw how satisfied he looked occupying a space he had clearly not paid for, but had been handed. Paige didn't push it further. Not yet. She turned and walked calmly toward her reassigned seat, the sounds of conversation and laughter in the premium section fading behind her as she passed into the transitional zone of the aircraft, where luxury bled into utility. Row 9 was the last of the Comfort Plus seating, barely one step above economy, and seat 9F was pressed directly against the rear lavatory, where the smell of sanitizer mingled with recycled air and engine vibration. As she sat down, she felt the armrest stick slightly beneath her palm and noticed the window was smudged with someone else's fingerprint. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Her boarding pass still read to a first class. She had the proof. But no one cared. To them, she wasn't supposed to belong in that space. And so they had adjusted reality until it suited their expectations. A few moments later, as passengers continued to board, a man across the aisle, a heavy-set middle-aged white man with slicked-back gray hair and a Rolex that caught the overhead light, leaned over slightly and said, "Rough morning." Paige turned toward him, unreadable. "Not particularly." He gave a casual chuckle. "Seems like they shuffled you around. That happens sometimes. Especially with, clerical errors. Tech can't always tell the difference between tiers or payment methods." Paige raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged, still smiling. "Just saying, I've seen it before. Someone wins a promo, gets bumped up for a mileage reward or charity donation, and suddenly thinks they've made it. System adjusts. Happens more than you'd think." Paige stared at him. "And what makes you think that's what happened here?" He raised both hands. "No offense. You seem sharp. Professional. Just not the usual first-class type." "And what is that type exactly?" she asked. "Well, typically not government suits." He chuckled again, then leaned back in his seat. Paige said nothing. She didn't need to. A flight attendant passed through the aisle a few minutes later and glanced toward her row, then whispered something to the colleague beside her. The other nodded, and in a voice just loud enough to carry, muttered, "Yeah, she's probably one of those non-profit shells. I can smell it. They're all the same. Pretend they're fixing the world while hiding donor money." Paige heard it clearly, every word. Her body remained still, but her mind recorded it like a file being etched onto glass. From the first smirk at the counter to the shuffling into the back, from the businessman's smug dismissal to the crew's whispered assumptions. This wasn't bad service. It was exclusion, executed through policy, justified by protocol, wrapped in smiles, and made possible by the comfort of those who believed their privilege protected them from consequence. But Paige had learned long ago that privilege was just a currency, and currencies could collapse. She reached slowly for her phone, tapped a secure note, and typed 4 lines. Flight 782. Reassigned from 2A without justification. Witnessed verbal profiling. Confirmed internal collusion. She hit save, locked the screen, and looked out the window as the final passengers boarded. Her seat rattled slightly as someone behind her pushed their bag underfoot. The scent of hand soap and engine oil drifted in from the rear. She exhaled once, slow and steady, then tilted her head slightly back. She wasn't just on a flight anymore. She was in the middle of a live investigation, one they didn't know they had triggered. Yet, the cabin lights dimmed as the final announcement echoed through the speakers, signaling that boarding was complete and the aircraft was preparing for departure. Paige sat motionless in her reassigned seat, 9F, her eyes focused on the smudged window, the faint reflection of her own calm, unreadable expression staring back at her. The smell of antiseptic from the nearby lavatory lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of how far removed she was from the space she had paid for and been denied. The engines began their steady rumble beneath her feet, but before the plane could push back from the gate, a sharp chime cut through the cabin noise. Moments later, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ms. Paige Campbell, please report to the front galley immediately. Ms. Paige Campbell, the captain would like a word with you." The murmurs began instantly. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some mouths whispered things they didn't think she would hear. Paige slowly rose, her posture composed, gathering her coat and phone with deliberate care. She didn't ask why. She already knew. As she walked up the aisle, the glances shifted from curious to suspicious. The man who had mocked her earlier in row 3 raised an eyebrow and muttered, well, what now?" Paige didn't look at him. She kept walking until she reached the front of the plane, where the curtain separated the crew's galley from the passenger cabin. There, standing stiffly with arms crossed, was the captain, a tall man in his early 50s with neatly trimmed silver hair and a jaw that had likely been locked since 1987. His expression was as formal as his uniform, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed something more than standard procedure. "Ms. Campbell," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either, "may I ask you to step inside for a quick clarification regarding your travel credentials?" Paige tilted her head slightly. "Is there a problem, Captain? We've received a passenger report and an internal flag from our crew regarding a potential mismatch between your booking and your ID," he explained, carefully choosing each word. "It's probably nothing, just something we need to verify before we proceed further." "A mismatch," Paige repeated. "As in, someone doubts that I'm who I say I am?" "It's not an accusation," he replied. "We just have to make sure all passengers on board are accounted for properly. You understand?" "What I understand," Paige said evenly, "is that I've been removed from a seat I paid for, placed next to a restroom, and now I'm being asked to defend my identity to two strangers in a hallway on a domestic flight." The captain didn't reply, but the lead flight attendant standing beside him, Carol, the same one who'd handed her the seat reassignment, interjected with a slight smirk. "It's just a formality, Ms. Campbell. You know, in these times, people do all sorts of things to access premium seating. We had someone last month use a fake nonprofit account to slip into first. Turned out he'd been on a no-fly list." Paige looked her straight in the eyes. "So I fit the profile?" Carol raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me. Let's not pretend this isn't profiling," Paige said. "I've already shown my ID twice. You know who I am. This isn't about verification. It's about intimidation." The captain stepped forward slightly, a palm raised. "Let's keep this civil. We're not accusing you of anything. But if you have any official documentation, something more than a standard ID, that could expedite this process." Paige's response was immediate. "I'm not obligated to provide anything beyond what I've already given you, and you're not authorized to demand it without probable cause." Carol scoffed. "Ma'am, we're trying to keep things professional. But if you have nothing to hide, why not just cooperate?" Paige smiled faintly, cold and unshaken. "Because being treated like a suspect on the basis of someone else's bias isn't something I'm required to tolerate. Not here. Not anywhere." Carol's voice dropped an octave, her frustration slipping past the facade. "You really want to make a scene, don't you? Look, I get it. You bought the ticket. You want the experience. But honestly, if getting a taste of first class means going through all this trouble, maybe it's not worth it. I mean, let's be real. Is it really worth the risk?" Paige narrowed her eyes. "What risk are you referring to?" Carol shrugged. "I don't know. Getting caught. Jail time. People go to prison over federal fraud every year. You wouldn't be the first." Paige's silence was louder than any retort. The captain, now clearly uncomfortable, shifted his stance. "Carol," he said under his breath, but Paige heard it. It didn't matter. The implication had already been made. They weren't verifying her identity. They were accusing her of identity theft, financial fraud, and perhaps even impersonating a government official. All without evidence. All because she didn't look the part. "We'll be making a formal report to our internal compliance team," the captain continued, trying to salvage authority. "You'll be allowed to remain on board, but security may meet us upon arrival for standard review." "Good," Paige replied. "I'll look forward to speaking with them." She turned on her heel, walking back down the aisle with the same steady gait she had when she entered. Every step felt heavier with the realization that the flight wasn't just a journey. It had become a stage, and every player had chosen their role. The whispers resumed as she passed, none louder than the one from the businessman in 3A, who leaned across the aisle to whisper just loud enough, "She's lucky she's not already in handcuffs." His companion responded with a quiet laugh. "Yeah, but what kind of scammer buys first class and sits next to a toilet? Amateurs." Paige reached her seat, slid in, and pulled the shade halfway down. Her face remained neutral, but her mind had shifted. This wasn't about a seat anymore. This was a line being drawn, and they had just crossed it. Paige remained silent as she returned to her seat, the path back from the front galley now crowded with whispered assumptions and sideways glances. She sat down in 9F without a word, adjusting the lapel of her blazer and gently placing her phone face down on the tray table. The faint whir of the overhead fans mixed with the soft hum of the engines, but her thoughts moved faster than either. The tone of the flight had changed. What began as exclusion was now tilting toward intrusion, and she could feel it happening before the next moment proved her right. 10 minutes passed before a flight attendant passed by with a beverage cart, her posture brisk, her tone efficient. As she paused near the row ahead of Paige, handing out ginger alish and sparkling waters with effortless cheer, Paige raised her hand and asked calmly, "Could I have a bottle of water, please?" The attendant glanced at her, without smiling. "Sorry, complimentary beverages are for first-class passengers only." Paige blinked once. "I am a first-class passenger. My boarding pass still reflects that, even if your crew changed my seat without consent." The attendant didn't flinch. Policy is based on location, not purchase. If you're sitting in main cabin plus, that's what applies. Even if it was your team who moved me, I'm just following service standards, she said, then moved the cart forward without another glance. Paige watched her go, then leaned back in her seat, absorbing the pettiness not as insult, but as confirmation. They weren't just trying to contain her, they were trying to erase her. Not through force, through limitation. One small indignity at a time. The smell of the lavatory returned, sharp and clinical, as someone stepped out behind her and let the door shut with a soft thud. Another flight attendant, this one a young man with nervous eyes and a clipped badge, appeared a moment later. He knelt beside her row with an apologetic smile. "Ms. Campbell," he said, "I'm terribly sorry, but we've received a note from the gate crew that your carry-on bag needs to be rechecked for a random security sweep. Post-boarding protocol. It won't take more than a minute." Paige gave him a long, slow look. "You're saying the TSA missed something?" "No, ma'am. This is internal, not TSA. We're required to inspect carry-ons flagged by the manifest for audit." "Flagged by who?" she asked. He hesitated. "The lead." Paige didn't argue. She reached down, pulled her carry-on into her lap, and unzipped it with methodical care. Inside were files, printed spreadsheets, sealed folders, a hard-shell case housing a secure laptop, and 2 Treasury-issued envelopes marked confidential use, authorized only. As she opened the flap, she watched the young man's eyes widen just slightly. He didn't reach into the bag. Instead, he looked at the contents with a growing discomfort, then held out his phone, pretending to scroll through a checklist. But the movement was off. Paige caught the subtle angle of the camera lens at the top of the screen, saw the way he paused with his finger just above the button, and the momentary shutter click that followed. She said nothing at first, just watched, recorded it with her own memory. His name tag, the angle, the position of the camera. After 5 seconds, she said calmly, "I hope you know that unauthorized photography of classified documents carries a federal penalty, especially if done by an employee in uniform." The attendant's face flushed. I didn't mean." "You already did it," Paige said. "I suggest you stop pretending otherwise." He quickly stood up, muttered something about completing the check later, and hurried back to the galley. Paige zipped her bag slowly and placed it beside her feet. 2 rows ahead, a pair of passengers were already leaning toward each other, whispering. The woman on the aisle tapped her phone's screen twice and turned it toward her husband. Paige caught a glimpse. A message app was open, and it read, "They think she forged some kind of federal badge." The husband replied, "The guy in uniform said she has fake IRS docs in her bag. Could be identity theft." Paige's lips didn't move, but her mind was moving in high gear. This wasn't accidental gossip. It was coordinated. Someone had taken a picture of her documentation and shared it with the crew, or worse, passed it among passengers. That message hadn't originated from nowhere. A few minutes later, she spotted Carol walking through the cabin again, this time holding the same internal tablet from earlier. She paused halfway through the aisle, tapped into a menu, and entered a note. Paige could see the screen reflected faintly in the darkened cabin window beside her. The line read, Passenger 9F, suspected misrepresentation. Monitoring advised. Monitoring. She wasn't being served anymore. She was being surveilled. Paige opened her phone and launched a secure government app built for field incidents. She began dictating in a whisper, so soft it couldn't be heard over the engine noise. Flight 782. Subject reclassified by crew without grounds. Verified image capture of restricted documents. Crew has shared unsubstantiated identity claims with civilian passengers. She stopped the recording, saved it to the encrypted log, and set the device down. Then she folded her hands in her lap, expression unreadable, gaze steady. If they had started a fire, they had no idea what kind of storm they were inviting. Around her, the conversations resumed at a lower pitch, filled with half-formed opinions and smug assumptions. But Paige no longer listened. She was tracking, gathering, every word, every glance, every falsehood. Because now this wasn't just bias. It was breach. And what came next? The hum of the aircraft deepened as the plane reached cruising altitude. But for Paige, altitude offered no elevation from the disdain quietly orbiting around her seat. She had barely returned from the invasive inspection of her carry-on when the next shift occurred. One not physical, but procedural. It began with a glimmer of a screen, a moment so brief most wouldn't have noticed. But Paige saw it. Carol, the lead flight attendant, stood near the forward galley again, her tablet angled slightly as she typed something in haste. The text on the screen flashed briefly before the notification vanished, but Paige caught it. Passenger 4D, potential fraud profile. Observe. It was short, coded, and damning. It wasn't just a comment, it was an internal classification, a digital signal passed to every staff device on board. In that moment, Paige wasn't just under suspicion. She had been marked, not officially, not by law, but by a system designed to act before evidence caught up to bias. The irony, of course, was not lost on her. Being profiled on the basis of having the exact kind of authority others on this plane pretended to understand, misused, or outright violated. She remained still in her seat, watching as the attendants subtly adjusted their behaviors. One no longer made eye contact. Another avoided her row entirely during beverage service. The younger male attendant who had earlier photographed her documents now kept his voice low when passing through, whispering to colleagues with sidelong glances. Paige took a slow breath, logged the internal designation into her encrypted notes, and noted the time, 10:43 a.m. 3 minutes later, another development escalated the situation, this time from across the aisle. A man who had been silent during the boarding process suddenly shifted in his seat and stood, smoothing the front of his tailored navy blazer. He was in his late 50s, with a shock of thick, silver hair and the kind of smugness that came not from charm, but unchecked confidence. Paige knew his type before he even opened his mouth. His kind lived in spreadsheets and shell accounts, moving money like ghosts across borders and lobbying against transparency bills with toothy smiles. He cleared his throat and turned, addressing no one in particular, but making sure his voice projected down the row. "You know, this is exactly the problem," he said loudly, tapping a finger against his folded Wall Street Journal. "People like her, people who work the system from the inside, pretending to be professionals while living off of federal scraps." Several heads turned. Paige didn't. Her gaze remained fixed forward. "You've got these so-called investigators," the man continued, "who walk around like they're some kind of authority. But all they really know is how to file for grant money and manipulate subsidies. It's not enforcement. It's exploitation." He looked around, inviting support, and a few neighboring passengers nodded cautiously. "I run a capital fund," he said, as if to establish hierarchy. "We deal with Treasury all the time. The real ones don't fly commercial. They're not buried in coach pretending to be first class." Paige finally turned, locking eyes with him. "Is there something you'd like to ask me directly?" she said calmly. The man blinked, surprised by her lack of flinch. "I don't need to ask you anything. I know your type. You exploit public image to earn private status. First-class ticket bought through someone else's pocket. Probably funded through a consulting scam or a diversity initiative that you milk dry. "And yet you're the one standing here explaining yourself," Paige replied, her tone even, her posture untouched. "If you're so sure about my background, why not list your own offshore holdings for context?" The man's expression stiffened. "What did you just say?" "I said you're loud," she answered, "but you're also sloppy. You've got 3 registered LLCs in Nevada that haven't filed state returns since 2020. One of them was linked to a political action committee that redirected funds to an unverified charity in Panama. I'd sit down before you give me more to document." Silence swept across the nearby rows. The man's bravado deflated visibly, his cheeks flushing beneath his expensive tan. He muttered something under his breath and slowly returned to his seat. A few passengers who had previously nodded along now avoided his gaze. Paige turned back to the window, her reflection flickering against the glass. She didn't need to defend herself. She carried facts like others carried credit cards, ready, precise, and impossible to refute. But still, the label "Observe" remained active in the system, invisible to passengers, but potent within the crew's interactions. Another attendant passed moments later, his eyes scanning her tray table with exaggerated interest. A different passenger, a woman in her 30s with designer sunglasses perched atop her head, tilted toward her companion and whispered, "I heard she's not even real IRS. Someone said she prints fake documents for appearances." Paige caught the words clearly, storing them with a silent efficiency. She tapped her phone once, resumed her dictation log, and said softly, "Public accusations from fellow passengers escalating. Internal notes confirm bias progression. Crew actively facilitating rumor propagation. Digital designation confirmed. Target behavior observed per notation." She locked the device again, folded her arms, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't merely discrimination. This was coordinated degradation. A manufactured reality built by quiet collusion, fueled by unchecked ego, and shielded by policy language like safety protocol and unverified status. And still, Paige waited, not because she was powerless, but because power, when held correctly, didn't need to announce itself with noise. It arrived at the precise moment silence failed to protect the guilty. And silence was cracking. The aftermath of the verbal ambush had barely settled before the flight crew made their next move. One so bold in its corporate precision that it disguised cruelty as compliance. Carol reappeared in the aisle, clutching her tablet and a printed form that had clearly just been pulled from the onboard document pouch reserved for incident containment. Her shoes clicked softly against the aisle flooring as she approached Paige's seat with a half-smile that had long since curdled into performative civility. "Ms. Campbell," she said, her voice dipped in faux professionalism. "In the interest of ensuring a smooth continuation of this flight, we'd like you to review and sign this acknowledgement." Paige glanced down at the paper being offered to her. It bore the heading "Passenger Resolution Consent Agreement" in bold, followed by several paragraphs of carefully legalized language. The summary was clear. By signing the document, she would waive any right to contest, complain, or report the treatment she had endured on board. It was, in essence, a non-disclosure agreement disguised as a behavioral waiver. "This is standard practice," Carol continued when Paige said nothing. "It just confirms that you're choosing to remain on board peacefully and agree not to pursue any grievance after the flight lands. Just a formality." Paige looked her in the eyes. "If it's standard, why haven't I seen anyone else sign one?" Carol hesitated, and that single moment of faltering shattered the illusion. Paige took the paper from her hand, scanned it silently, then held it up. "This says that I'm voluntarily choosing not to report any incidents of misconduct, harassment, or violation of federal privacy laws, and that I absolve the airline of liability, regardless of what occurs between now and landing." "It's just language," Carol said too quickly. "It protects everyone involved." "No," Paige said. "It protects you." The seats around them grew quiet, passengers pretending to sleep while clearly straining to hear every word. Paige's voice remained low, unwavering. "You're attempting to silence me preemptively. You know this has gone too far, and now you're hoping I'll sign this and disappear like a good little anomaly who dared to step into your world." Carol's smile flickered. but she didn't reply. Instead, another presence entered the moment. The man seated 2 rows ahead, older, white, immaculately dressed in a dark green cashmere jacket with gold cufflinks, stood up and turned toward them. His voice cut through the cabin like polished steel. "Let me," he said, stepping into the aisle and pulling out a crisp $500 bill from his money clip. "I think we've all seen enough. This is uncomfortable for everyone, and frankly, it's a little sad." He extended the money toward Paige with a practiced flourish. "Here, take this. No hard feelings. I think we can all agree this isn't really your space. No shame in trying it once, but maybe it's best to leave the high-tier experience to those who can maintain it." Several passengers stiffened but said nothing. No one intervened. The entire aisle held its breath as the bill hung in the air like a blade between them. Paige didn't move. Her hands remained folded on her lap, eyes locked on his with the weight of someone who had seen far worse than arrogance parading as generosity. "You're offering me money to forget this happened?" she asked quietly. The man chuckled. "I'm offering you an exit. A clean one. You're clearly in over your head, sweetheart. Everyone here knows it. Let's just avoid the scene." Carol interjected gently, "Sir, perhaps," but he raised a hand. "No. I've flown this route 36 times this year. I've donated to the airline's expansion fund. I have a right to protect the environment I paid for. This situation has disrupted that. I'm simply restoring the balance." Paige finally lifted a hand, not to take the money, but to motion him back. "You can sit down now," she said. "And while you're at it, consider this. The last man who tried to buy my silence with cash was indicted on federal charges 6 months later. I still have the statement he signed." The man blinked, the color draining from his face by degrees. "Excuse me. Your name is Franklin M. Avery, Managing Director at Clayton Shore Holdings, currently under preliminary investigation for illicit securities, routing, and improper charitable deductions filed through a subsidiary in Belize. The documentation is extensive." Gasps rippled through the cabin, hushed but undeniable. Paige didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Now," she continued, still calm, "if you'd like to add bribery and attempted coercion to your portfolio of problems, go ahead and keep that bill in the air." Avery's hand lowered immediately, the money disappearing into his jacket as if scorched. "I don't speak," Paige said. "You've already said enough, and I've documented every word." Carol looked horrified now, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "Ms. Campbell," she began, her voice cracking, "I didn't know. You didn't care to know." Paige corrected her. "You saw someone who didn't look like you, occupying space you didn't think they deserved, and instead of adjusting your perspective, you tried to eliminate the person." The silence that followed was absolute. Paige turned her head slightly, just enough to glance toward the overhead bin where her carry-on sat, still zipped, still full of classified files, still ready to burn through the careers of everyone who had made the mistake of thinking she was invisible. Carol took a step back, clearly shaken. I'll make a note that the form was declined." Paige nodded. "Do that. And while you're updating your records, let your compliance department know they should start assembling their legal team. They're going to need it." She sat back, the paper still in her lap, unsigned, her gaze steady. Around her, the passengers who had smirked now sat rigid and pale. A few reached for their phones, but the in-flight network had gone mysteriously dark. Paige smiled to herself. It had already begun. The quiet that followed Paige's dismantling of Franklin Avery was the kind of silence usually reserved for courtrooms or disaster sites, dense, brittle, and waiting to shatter. Carol had retreated to the front galley with eyes wide and fingers trembling, and none of the passengers dared whisper now. The tension, once pointed at Paige, had now turned inward, wrapping around the necks of everyone who had played a part in the slow-motion ambush they thought would go unanswered. Paige sat still for a moment longer, letting the weight of the room settle before she made her next move. She reached above, retrieved her carry-on from the overhead bin, and set it gently across her lap. The zipper opened with a soft hiss, but its sound cut through the cabin like a blade. From inside, Paige pulled a matte black folder stamped with the seal of the Department of the Treasury, real, federal, and very much binding. She flipped it open to reveal a signed federal subpoena issued to Charles Deacon, the current CEO of Northeast Air Group, the parent company of the airline operating the flight. The document was dated 2 weeks earlier and bore her own signature as the lead investigator for Treasury's Division of Illicit Finance Oversight. It had been hand-delivered to their corporate headquarters, with response demanded within 15 business days. That window was closing fast. She placed the document flat on her tray table, rotated it so the passenger across the aisle, who had mocked her earlier, could see the letterhead clearly. He paled. Paige then reached for her encrypted mobile, a sleek device with no commercial branding, secured through a government-only line, and input a biometric scan. The interface loaded instantly with a simple prompt. Initiate secure call? She tapped yes. The call connected without delay. A voice answered immediately. Operations command. This is Gateway 7. Line secured. Paige spoke softly, but with absolute clarity. This is Agent Paige Campbell, badge for 7392C. Initiate protocol update for investigation file 267A. I need a full brief on Northeast Air Group and all subsidiary tax behavior routed through offshore intermediaries. Pull everything from Q3 last year forward. Cross-reference with active shell companies in Zurich, Belize, and Singapore. This is now a live escalation. Confirmed. The voice replied, tone sharpening. Do you require a relay to enforcement? Affirmative, Paige said, and push the audit log to my device. I'm currently on board Flight 782, operated by a Northeast subsidiary. I've been forcibly reassigned, profiled, and publicly degraded by staff acting on behalf of a company under current financial investigation. Connect me to financial intelligence in 2 minutes. Understood. Live channel pending. Do you want real-time data visualization? Activate it. This is no longer observation. This is intervention. Paige ended the call and opened her laptop. Within seconds, her dashboard synced with the Treasury's secure network. Heat maps flared across the screen, tracing capital movement through international accounts. She selected the node tagged Northeast Ops Bermuda routing, and a list of transaction IDs unfurled down the screen. One transfer stood out, a $42 million payment routed through a Cayman Islands holding company registered as Sable Harvest Limited, which Paige already knew was a phantom entity created solely for regulatory evasion. She flagged it with a single keystroke. Behind her, a murmur rose as passengers started noticing her screen. Rows of numbers, acronyms, tax codes, wire trail maps. It looked like chaos, but to anyone familiar with the language of corruption, it was a mirror. The businessman in 3A, who had once called her a scam artist, leaned forward now, mouth slightly open, face bloodless. Is that, he whispered, real? Paige didn't look up. More real than the deductions you've been claiming since 2019. The whisper traveled fast. Within 30 seconds, the air felt colder. A passenger too rose up, reached for his bag, and began rifling through it, clearly anxious. Another woman tried to power off her phone, but Paige's eyes caught the screen. An email thread titled Political Contributions, Northeast PAC. She took note. Carol appeared again, cautiously, eyes scanning the tray table. Ms. Campbell, she said, voice more careful now. I just received an alert on the crew panel. There's been a system-wide lock request tied to your name. It says Treasury Oversight. What's happening? Paige met her eyes. What's happening is what should have happened a long time ago. Your airline received a federal subpoena 2 weeks ago and ignored it. You've been under review for tax fraud and international laundering, totaling $2.4 billion. I'm the lead investigator on that case. And now, you've made the mistake of insulting the one person on board with the authority to bring it all down. Carol's mouth opened, then closed again. Her hands fumbled behind her back as she instinctively stepped back. I didn't know. We didn't know. You didn't want to know, Paige replied. You wanted to assume. You wanted to control the narrative before you understood the story. Paige's phone buzzed again. A message flashed across the screen. Audit analysis live. Full report syncing. SCCIRS crosslink activated. Media blackout advised. Ground response ETA 22 minutes. She turned her screen just slightly, letting the top corner of the display be seen by the passengers nearby. The header read, Internal Fraud Escalation, Tier 1 Entity, Field Agent, Campbell, P. For the first time since the plane had left the ground, no one dared speak. No accusations. No whispers. No smugness. Just stunned silence as the reality unfolded that the woman they had mocked, insulted, and tried to push out of their elite space was the very person with the authority and the backing to take that space away from them entirely. Paige sat back in her seat, eyes still locked on the live audit streaming down her screen. More names popped up. More numbers. She'd let them watch if they had the nerve. Let them see what consequences looked like, line by line. The first sign that the system was no longer theirs came not from a scream or confrontation, but from the quiet vibration of the crew panel mounted beside the forward galley. Carol had just retreated there to find a sliver of breath when the monitor flickered. The usual interface for passenger requests and flight data suddenly overridden by a pulsing red alert. Urgent. Halt all system access. Potential leak. Detected level 7 classified materials in motion Treasury. Oversight engaged. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating to touch it as if the message might burn. She tapped once, then again, and watched as all standard controls grayed out. Beverage logs. Passenger service call buttons. Internal communication. All frozen. The aircraft was in the air, but everything on board that connected to the airline's infrastructure had gone dark. In the next row, a steward attempting to open the Wi-Fi interface for cabin announcements found himself locked out, greeted only by a warning banner. Access denied pending federal lockdown. Carol whispered, "Oh my God," but even she didn't know which part she was reacting to, the system failure or the realization of who was responsible. Behind her, in 9F, Paige was scrolling through names, watching audit hits pop up like digital flares. Charles Deacon, CEO, under formal subpoena. Franklin Avery, attempted coercion, known fund laundering. Leah Grant, first-class passenger, board member of a logistics firm with known offshore holdings. Paige's eyes narrowed as another name appeared. Hal Thomason, Row 2D, senior advisor to a political action committee currently under federal ethics investigation for illegal contribution routing. She tapped twice, flagged the connection, and cross-referenced campaign records. In less than 30 seconds, the match was confirmed. Hal was attempting to log into his brokerage account on the in-flight app, unaware that his connection had just triggered a government protocol response. The monitor in front of his seat froze, then blinked once, and shut down completely. He leaned back with a frown, muttering, "What the hell?" As the minutes passed, panic began to ripple beneath the surface of a first-class cabin. Not loud, not visible, but internal, hands fidgeting, eyes darting toward Paige's screen, brows furrowed at devices no longer working. The man in 1A whispered urgently to his wife, "I think we're on a watch list," and she whispered back, "She's the one. They're saying she signed that audit order last week. The $2.4 billion seizure. My firm got flagged." Someone else chimed in from 2C, voice thin with disbelief, "She's Campbell? The Campbell? I thought she worked in policy, not enforcement." Paige didn't look up. She let them connect the dots at their own pace, each one of them revisiting every word they'd said to her, every smirk, every assumption, every time they decided she didn't belong. Carol stumbled down the aisle, trying to maintain composure, but every step looked heavier. She stopped beside Paige, visibly rattled, her voice quiet. "Ms. Campbell, there's been a lockout. We don't have access to anything. Our messages are down. Passenger controls offline. The captain, he wants to know what's going on." Paige closed her laptop slowly, turned it slightly so Carol could see the final tab still open. It displayed the official Treasury seal above a headline that read, "Real-time surveillance initiated Tier 1 financial entities under audit lead agent. Campbell, Page A." Carol's eyes widened as she read the name again and again, trying to comprehend that the woman she had moved next to the lavatory, who she'd suggested might be committing fraud, was not only real, but one of the highest-ranking investigators in the federal system. Page spoke calmly. The system's been locked because this aircraft is now considered part of a live audit zone. Until I file my debrief and the agents on the ground confirm custody of the data, all digital access is paused to preserve evidence integrity. You might want to tell the captain that before he tries to reset anything manually. Carol nodded without blinking, lips parted but unable to speak, and turned shakily toward the cockpit. The captain, who had watched the cabin through the open door since the disturbance began, didn't wait for her report. He stepped into the aisle himself and approached Page directly. "Ms. Campbell," he said, not unkindly, but with a caution that was hard to miss. "We didn't know. I didn't know." Page stood slowly. Her posture was professional, composed. Her presence now undeniable. "That's not the problem," she said. "The problem is you didn't ask. You assumed. You delegated suspicion downward, and you empowered your crew to act based on comfort, not conduct." The captain nodded, shame blooming behind his eyes. Page didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth had already unraveled. And then, the final crack came from a passenger who had said nothing all flight. A woman seated in 3B, quiet, elegantly dressed, hands folded in her lap like a judge on recess. She looked at Page and said, "We're all on that list, aren't we?" Page paused. "You tell me." The woman glanced down at her lap, then sighed. "I gave money to a consulting firm in Zurich 6 months ago. They promised discretion. I should have known better." Page didn't offer comfort. She offered silence, and that was worse. By the time the captain returned to the cockpit, nearly every passenger in the front section had realized their own version of the same truth. They weren't untouchable. They weren't invisible. And the person they had tried to erase had just activated a mechanism none of them could stop. Page returned to her seat, laptop back on her tray, audit log still building. On screen, a new alert appeared. Ground assets in motion. Priority intercept requested. Coordination underway. She read it once, then typed back. Confirm deployment. Data integrity stable. Cabin environment subdued. Subject awareness rising. The descent into Washington, D.C. began without the usual cadence of announcements or routine chatter. Instead, the cabin remained blanketed in a silence so dense it felt manufactured. Page remained seated in 9F, her laptop resting open but idle now, the audit feed still pulsing gently in the background as the aircraft angled downward through streaks of soft gray cloud. Most passengers had long since stowed their devices, not because of protocol, but because nothing they could tap, text, or scroll would change what was waiting for them on the ground. First class was no longer a sanctuary of luxury. It had become a waiting room for consequence. Across the cabin, the man who had once offered her $500 to disappear now stared blankly ahead, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his cufflinks no longer symbols of confidence, but shackles of implication. Behind him, a woman in row 2 trembled slightly as she whispered into her palm, not realizing that even her voice couldn't be heard. Her name was already logged in a federal system 2 steps ahead of her desperation. As the wheels touched down with a heavy thud against the tarmac, the tension broke not with applause or relief, but with an eerie stillness, as if everyone knew that what followed wasn't the end of a journey, but the start of a reckoning. The plane taxied not to the main terminal, but to a restricted bay on the far side of the airport, a choice not explained by the captain, but clearly felt by every soul on board. Through the window, Page watched as 2 unmarked SUVs pulled up beside the aircraft, each flanked by black-suited agents wearing discreet lapel pins, the kind that didn't need a badge to prove who they were. Moments later, a third vehicle arrived, this one bearing the unmistakable emblem of the Department of the Treasury's Office of Legal Enforcement. The aircraft door opened not to a breezeway, but to a portable stairwell where a pair of agents ascended calmly, eyes sweeping the cabin not with suspicion, but with certainty. The lead agent, a tall black woman in her 40s with a presence that radiated command, stepped onto the plane and held up a tablet. "We are here under federal authority," she announced, her voice firm but not aggressive. "Please remain in your seats. We will be escorting a number of individuals for questioning in relation to an active investigation. If your name is called, comply immediately." She began to read the list. Franklin Avery. The man in the green cashmere jacket closed his eyes briefly, then stood without a word, escorted by 2 agents who flanked him with the calm precision of seasoned enforcers. Al Thomason. The political advisor from row 2 didn't speak, didn't protest, simply placed his phone face down on the tray and rose. Carol Hastings. Tanya Ruiz. Mitchell Grant. The 3 crew members visibly stiffened. Carol looked as though her breath had left her body entirely. Tanya whispered, "No, no, no," as if she were still hoping this was just a nightmare and not the result of every choice she'd made over the last 4 hours. Michael Broder, Terminal Oversight Supervisor. JFK International. The name wasn't a passenger, it was the man who authorized the boarding pass override and initiated the reassignment that removed Paige from first class. His name hadn't appeared on any manifest, but it didn't need to. Paige had submitted it via encrypted upload the moment she was forced to change seats. As each person was let off the plane, no one in the cabin spoke. A few passengers looked down at their laps. Others stared blankly ahead. No one dared pull out a phone. No one filmed. The show wasn't theirs anymore. The Treasury agents moved with quiet authority, no cuffs, no shouting, just consequence manifested in motion. Paige remained seated until the last subject was escorted off the aircraft, then stood slowly, collected her things, and walked toward the exit as one of the agents stepped aside. "Agent Campbell," the woman said with a nod. "We've secured the Financial Command Center. The holding order for Northeast Air Group has been executed. Immediate freeze placed on 31% of available capital and 62 named accounts. We've flagged 7 board members for compliance audit." "Good," Paige said simply. "What about public disclosure?" "Minimal for now," the agent replied. "We're holding the press line until your final report is filed. But internal memos have already reached the DOJ and the FAA. They're preparing coordination briefs. And the ground team? All active. Legal detachment is already at Northeast headquarters. Offices have been sealed. Digital access revoked. Documents impounded. You'll have full files uploaded to your secure drive by end of day." Paige gave a brief nod and stepped onto the stairs. The sunlight hit her face as she descended, not blinding, but sharp enough to sting. The tarmac was unusually quiet. No terminal crowds. No press. Just procedure and purpose. When she reached the ground, the agent beside her handed her a document sleeve. Inside, confirmation of the company's asset freeze, signed by the federal financial oversight judge that morning. "It's official," the agent said. "They're going to fight it, but they won't get far." Paige didn't respond. She was already scanning the details. For $127 million frozen from main accounts, $890 million in projected capital paused pending review, and the rest under provisional lock. Enough to paralyze the operations of a corporation that had once acted like it could fly above accountability. In her ear, a secure comms ping lit up. Northeast Asset Control confirmed. Civil Rights Division requests interview logs from in-flight incident. Preliminary findings support escalation to Ethics Board. Paige closed the folder and walked toward the waiting vehicle. Behind her, the cabin door closed again, not with finality, but with the sound of a seal on history. The next morning, sunlight broke gently across the glass walls of the Treasury's district satellite office, casting long golden streaks across the tile as Paige sat quietly in the corner of the debrief room, fingers lightly touching the edge of the closed folder on her lap, her badge resting on the table beside her. The operation was complete. The audit initiated. The freeze order enforced. The names filed. And yet, despite the legal precision of every action taken, her mind remained on something far less concrete, what people remembered when the headlines faded, when the damage had been done, and all that was left was the slow crawl toward accountability. A soft knock at the door shifted her attention. It opened slowly, and a young woman stepped inside, not in uniform this time, but in civilian clothes, pressed blouse, navy slacks, a pair of plain flats that looked borrowed from someone who hadn't expected to meet a federal investigator that morning. Paige recognized her instantly. Tanya Ruiz, the junior flight attendant who had whispered assumptions behind her back, watched silently as others undermined her, and who now stood before her not with defensiveness, but a tremble in her hands and eyes reddened by sleepless guilt. "Agent Campbell," Tanya began, her voice tight, "I asked if I could come in, just for a moment." Paige didn't nod, but she didn't say no. Tanya took that as permission and stepped closer, her fingers twisting a folded paper she couldn't seem to stop holding. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said quickly, then paused. "That's not true. I knew. I just didn't think it mattered." Paige looked at her, silent. Tanya swallowed. "I studied human rights in college. I wrote essays on systemic discrimination. I volunteered for advocacy programs. But none of that stopped me from going along with everything that happened on that flight. I didn't speak up. I didn't challenge what I heard. I just blended in. And that makes me part of it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I watched you get humiliated, and I was afraid to even meet your eyes. Not because you were wrong, but because I was." Paige's face remained calm, her posture as controlled as it had been on the plane, but Tanya's words pierced something beneath that composure, not in pain, but in a quiet hope that maybe someone, just one, had absorbed the lesson not with shame, but with hunger to do better. Tanya unfolded the paper in her hand. "I found this in the back pocket of my crew bag last night. It's the waiver form we asked you to sign. I didn't throw it away. I couldn't." She placed it on the table. "I came to give it to you. Not because I think it'll undo anything, but because it reminds me that silence is never neutral. And if you're still willing, I want to learn. I want to be better." Paige took a slow breath. She didn't scold. She didn't list infractions or repeat federal codes. Instead, she picked up the paper, looked at it for a long moment, and then folded it carefully in half, setting it aside. "I don't want anyone fired," she said finally. "I don't want people dragged across headlines just to make a point. What I want is understanding. What I want is change that lasts longer than fear." Tanya blinked. "Then what should I do?" "You can start," Paige said, "by signing up for the financial equity and civil service training we're launching next quarter. It's mandatory for federal contractors, but I'm offering it to airline staff on a volunteer basis. We cover everything: bias recognition, service ethics, regulatory structure, and the lived experience of those on the other side of the counter. You'll learn not just the law, but the damage it was written to prevent." Tanya's lips parted in surprise. "You'd let me in?" "I'd insist," Paige said. "If you're ready." Tanya nodded, tears welling as she stepped back. "Thank you," she whispered. Paige didn't smile, not exactly, but there was something softer in the way she gathered her folder, rose from her chair, and offered a final piece of clarity as she reached for the door. "It was never about power, Tanya. It was always about dignity. Now you understand the difference. Don't forget it." And as Paige walked out into the rising hum of the morning city, past rows of agents, analysts, and operatives moving through their schedules like clockwork, she didn't carry triumph in her stride. She carried purpose, one steady step at a time, toward the next flight, the next file, the next room full of people who thought justice only arrived in headlines, until it sat down beside them and quietly rewrote everything they thought they knew. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. What part hit you the hardest? Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels.